My husband passed away. A week later, my son and his gold digger wife's expensive lawyers made sure I got nothing. I lost my job, my home, everything. Enjoy sharing food with dogs on the street, she texted. Driving Uber at 53, a stranger stared at me. You're Richard Hale's granddaughter, aren't you? He said. Your grandfather and I started a company in 1974. He owned 50%. When he died, the shares went to you. He showed me the current value, $800 million. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Nola, and at 63 years old, I thought I'd seen the worst life could throw at me. I was wrong. The mahogany conference table felt cold under my trembling hands as I sat across from my daughter-in-law, Nora. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the polished surface while she delivered the words that would destroy everything I'd worked for. We've decided your services are no longer needed at Hartwell & Associates, she said, her voice crisp and professional. The company my late husband had built from nothing, where I'd worked for 27 years, first as his partner, then as operations manager after his death. Nora, there must be some mistake, I whispered, my throat dry. This is my company too. David and I. Was your company, she interrupted, sliding a thick folder across the table. Your son Michael has decided it's time for new leadership. Fresh perspectives. You understand. My son, my only child, who sat beside his wife like a statue, refusing to meet my eyes. The boy I'd raised alone after his father died, whom I'd put through college, whose wedding I'd paid for when they were too proud to accept help from Nora's wealthy family. Michael? My voice cracked as I turned to him. Please, just look at me. He finally lifted his head, and what I saw there broke my heart. Cold indifference, as if I were a stranger. Not the woman who'd sat by his bedside through pneumonia, who'd taught him to drive, who'd held him when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Mom, Nora's right. The company needs to evolve. Your methods are outdated. Clients have been complaining. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I knew every client personally. Mrs. Henderson still sent me Christmas cards. The Johnsons had specifically requested me for their estate planning. These weren't just business relationships, they were friendships built over decades. What clients? I demanded, finding some strength in my voice. Name one complaint. Nora's lips curved into what might have been a smile on anyone else, but on her looked predatory. I don't think that's necessary. What matters is moving forward. We're prepared to offer you a severance package. She opened the folder, revealing documents already prepared, already signed by Michael. My termination. Effective immediately. 30 days severance for 27 years of work. The house, our family home that David had left to both Michael and me, would need to be sold to consolidate assets. You can't do this, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they could. When David died, I'd trusted Michael to handle the legal paperwork. I'd been drowning in grief, and he'd assured me everything would be fine. Now I realized how naive I'd been. Actually, we can, Nora said, producing another set of documents. Michael holds controlling interest in the company and the house. You'll need to vacate by the end of the month. The room spun around me. 27 years of my life, gone. The home where I'd raised my son, where David and I had planned to grow old together, taken away with the stroke of a pen. Michael, please. I tried one more time. I'm your mother. He finally spoke, his voice flat and rehearsed. You were never really cut out for this business, Mom. Dad always said so. This is better for everyone. The lie was so cruel, so calculated, that I actually gasped. David had always praised my instincts, my way with clients. He'd often said I was the heart of the business while he was the head. I stood on shaking legs, the weight of my 63 years suddenly feeling crushing. I need my personal things from my office. Already packed, Nora said, gesturing to 2 small boxes by the door. 27 years reduced to 2 cardboard boxes. The drive home, to what was still my home for 3 more weeks, passed in a blur. I sat in my driveway for an hour, unable to face going inside. The house felt different already, like I was trespassing. That night, I called my sister Janet. We hadn't spoken much since David's funeral, but I needed someone, anyone who remembered the person I used to be. "Nola, it's late. Is everything okay?" I told her everything, the words tumbling out between sobs. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Well," Janet finally said, her voice carefully neutral, "maybe it's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet." "What?" "You've always depended on someone else, Nola. First David, then expecting Michael to take care of you forever. Maybe this is a wake-up call." I hung up without another word. Even my own sister believed their lies. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare. Every day brought new humiliations. The house sold within a week. Nora had apparently already had buyers lined up. My belongings were packed and moved to a storage unit I could barely afford. Michael never called, never checked on me. I found a tiny studio apartment across town, the kind of place I'd never imagined living. 1 room, a kitchenette, and a bathroom so small I could barely turn around. The walls were paper thin, and my neighbor's television kept me awake most nights. My savings, what little David had left me after medical bills, dwindled quickly. The job market for 63-year-old women was brutal. Every interview ended the same way. "We'll be in touch," followed by silence. I suspected Nora was making calls, poisoning any potential opportunities. Within 2 months, I was down to my last $100. That's when I saw the ad for Uber drivers. The requirements were simple: clean driving record, decent car, smartphone. I qualified barely. My first day driving was a disaster. I got lost twice, accidentally charged a passenger for the wrong trip, and made exactly $23 in 8 hours. But it was money, and I needed every cent. The nights were the hardest. Driving through the neighborhoods where my former life existed, past the office where I'd once belonged, sometimes even past my old house. Nora had already redecorated. The rose garden David and I had planted together was gone, replaced with modern landscaping that looked expensive and soulless. 3 months after losing everything, I was living day to day, sometimes sleeping in my car between rides to save on gas money for the drive back to my apartment. The studio rent was due, and I was $50 short. That's when the text message came. It was from Nora, sent to my old number that I'd somehow forgotten to change. "Hope you're enjoying sharing food with dogs on the street. Should have been more grateful for what you had." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking with exhaustion and something else, a rage so pure it scared me. She wasn't content with taking everything. She needed to grind me into the dirt. I turned off my phone and kept driving through the night, picking up drunk college students and tired hospital workers, wondering how my life had become so small, so meaningless. At 63, I was starting over with nothing, and the people who should have loved me most were celebrating my destruction. But sometimes, when you think you've hit rock bottom, life has one more surprise waiting. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 months after I'd started driving for Uber. I was exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee when a delivery truck ran a red light and slammed into my passenger side. The impact threw me against the driver's side window, and everything went black. I woke up in County General's emergency room with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, explained that my car was totaled. The other driver had no insurance. "Is there someone we can call?" she asked gently. "Family? A friend?" I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains. "No," I whispered. "There's no one." The truth was devastating. I had a son, a sister, former colleagues, neighbors I'd known for years. But there truly was no one I could call, no one who would come. I spent 2 days in the hospital because I had nowhere else to go. The social worker, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, helped me apply for emergency assistance, $50 a day for a shelter bed, if one was available. "Mrs. Patterson," she said softly, "I have to ask, do you really have no family? No one at all?" I thought about Michael, probably having dinner with Nora in my old dining room, eating off the china that had been my mother's. "I have a son," I said finally, "but he wouldn't come." She looked at me with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. "Would you like me to try calling him anyway?" For a moment, I almost said yes. Maybe if he knew I was hurt, maybe if he saw me in a hospital bed, some part of the boy I'd raised would remember that he'd once loved me. "No," I said, "don't call him. When I was discharged, I had no car, no home, and medical bills I couldn't pay. The shelter was full, so I spent my first night out of the hospital on a bench at the bus station, my few belongings in a garbage bag beside me. The security guard, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, woke me up at 3 a.m. "Ma'am, you can't sleep here." "I'm sorry," I said, struggling to stand with my injured ribs. "I'll move along." He watched me gather my things, his face troubled. "Lady, there's a shelter about 6 blocks that way. They might have space for tonight." The walk took me 45 minutes, stopping every block to rest and breathe through the pain. The shelter was a converted warehouse that smelled like disinfectant and despair. I filled out forms with shaking hands, answering questions about my mental health, my substance abuse history, my criminal record. "First time?" asked the woman processing my paperwork. "Yes." "It gets easier," she said, but her eyes said otherwise. I was assigned a bottom bunk in a room with 20 other women. The woman above me, Maria, had been there 8 months. She'd lost her job when the factory closed, then her apartment, then her dignity piece by piece. "What's your story?" she asked in the darkness, her voice floating down from the top bunk. "My family threw me away," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "Mine too," she replied. "Seems to be going around?" The days blurred together. Morning lineup for breakfast, job searching on the library's computers, evening return to the shelter. I applied for every position I could find: cashier, receptionist, cleaning lady. Nobody wanted to hire a 63-year-old woman with no recent work history and a shelter address. 2 weeks after the accident, I was sitting on the library steps when my phone buzzed. A notification from Facebook. Someone had tagged me in a post. It was Nora. The photo showed her and Michael at some charity gala, both dressed in expensive formal wear. She was wearing the diamond necklace that had been David's last gift to me, the one I'd lost during the move. The caption read, "So grateful for family who understand that some people are just toxic energy that needs to be removed from your life. Sometimes the kindest thing is letting people face the consequences of their own choices." The comments were worse. Friends and acquaintances who'd known me for years, all agreeing with her. "So true. You're better off without the drama. Some people never learn." My hands shook as I scrolled through them. These people had been to my home, had eaten at my table, had celebrated holidays with David and me. Now they were applauding my destruction. But the worst part was seeing who had liked the post. Michael. My own son had liked a post celebrating my homelessness. I closed the app and put my phone away, but the damage was done. That night at the shelter, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was how my story ended. Alone, forgotten, destroyed by the very people who should have protected me. The next morning brought a new humiliation. At the welfare office, applying for food stamps, I ran into Mrs. Chen from my old neighborhood. Her eyes widened when she saw me in line. "Nola? My goodness, what are you doing here?" I wanted to lie, to make up some story that would preserve what little dignity I had left. Instead, I told her the truth. Everything. The forced retirement, losing the house, the accident, the shelter. Her face went through a range of emotions: shock, pity, discomfort, and finally something that looked almost like fear, as if poverty might be contagious. "I had no idea," she said. "Michael never mentioned. I mean, at the block party last month, he said you were traveling, seeing the country. Even then, even as I lived in a shelter, they were lying about me, erasing me from their narrative completely." "Well," Mrs. Chen said, backing away slightly, "I hope things turn around for you." She hurried off without looking back, leaving me standing in line with my forms and my shame. That night, another text came from Nora. This time it was a photo of my old bedroom, completely redecorated in black and white. "Finally got rid of all that old lady clutter," the message read. The house feels so much cleaner now. The room where David and I had shared 30 years of marriage, where I'd nursed him through his final illness, where I'd cried myself to sleep after he died, reduced to old lady clutter. I turned off my phone and buried my face in the thin shelter pillow, trying to muffle my sobs so I wouldn't wake the other women. Tomorrow would bring more rejections, more humiliations, more reminders that at 63 I was invisible and worthless, but I couldn't give up, not yet. Something deep inside me, some stubborn part that even Nora couldn't break, refused to let them win completely. I would survive this, somehow, even if I didn't know how. The phone buzzed once more before I fell asleep. Another message from Nora. Hope you're comfortable with your new lifestyle. You chose this path. Now live with it. I stared at the words until they blurred together, then deleted the message without responding. Let her think she'd broken me completely. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to die. By January, I'd been living in the shelter for 2 months. The social worker had helped me get a used Honda Civic, 15 years old with a dented bumper, but it ran. I was back to driving for Uber, though the money barely covered gas and the cheapest meals I could find. The night everything changed started like any other. It was a Thursday, cold enough that my breath fogged in the car, and I'd been driving for 6 hours with only $38 to show for it. My ribs still ached when I turned too quickly, a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. The pickup was from the Meridian Hotel, one of those luxury places downtown where a single night's stay cost more than I made in a week. I pulled up to the circular drive, feeling embarrassed by my beat-up car among the sleek BMWs and Mercedes. The passenger who climbed into my back seat was a man in his late 70s, impeccably dressed in a wool overcoat and leather gloves. His hair was silver white, neatly combed, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world with dignity despite his age. "Good evening," he said, his voice cultured, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "Renaissance Office Complex, please. Building C." I'd driven past that complex before. Sleek glass towers where the city's wealthiest conducted their business. "Of course," I said, pulling into traffic. For the first few minutes, we rode in silence. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, something about him nagging at the edges of my memory. He sat perfectly still, hands folded, watching the city lights blur past the window. Then, as we stopped at a red light, he leaned forward slightly. "Forgive me," he said, "but you're Nola Patterson, aren't you?" My blood ran cold. Had Nora's campaign of destruction reached even this stranger? "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Not directly, no, but I knew your grandfather, Richard Hale." The light turned green, but I almost forgot to drive. Nobody had mentioned my grandfather's name in years. He'd died when I was 12, and my mother had rarely spoken of him afterward. "You knew my grandfather?" "Very well indeed. Richard and I were business partners for many years." The man's voice grew warm with memory. "My name is Edmund Blackwell. Your grandfather and I started our first company together in 1974. I pulled into the Renaissance Complex parking lot, but instead of stopping at Building C, I found an empty space and turned to face him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell, but I think there's been some mistake. My grandfather was a factory worker. He never owned a business." Edmund's expression grew puzzled, then concerned. "My dear, that's not correct." Richard was my partner in Blackwell Hale Technologies. We developed some of the earliest computer networking systems, quite revolutionary at the time. My head was spinning. This couldn't be right. My mother had always said Grandpa Richard worked at the textile mill until he died. Never mentioned anything about technology or business partnerships. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I said carefully. "My grandfather died with nothing. My grandmother struggled financially for years after he passed." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the dim light from the parking lot lamps. "How old are you, my dear?" 63. "And your mother's name?" "Dorothy Hale. Was Dorothy Hale." His face went pale. "Dorothy is dead?" "She died 8 years ago." Edmund closed his eyes, his hands gripping his walking stick tighter. I've been looking for Richard's family for 20 years. Dorothy. She disappeared after Richard died. I tried to reach her, but she'd moved, changed her name. I hired investigators, but... What are you talking about? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Why would you be looking for us? Edmund reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Because, my dear Nola, when your grandfather died, his 50% stake in our company passed to his heirs. Legally, those shares belong to you. I stared at the folder like it might bite me. That's impossible. We never inherited anything. The shares were held in trust, managed by a legal firm. For years, we assumed Dorothy would eventually come forward. When she didn't, we continued to grow the company, setting aside her portion according to the original partnership agreement. My hands were shaking now. What kind of company? Technology consulting, primarily. Government contracts, private sector development. We've done quite well over the years. How well? Edmund opened the folder and pulled out a financial statement. The numbers swam before my eyes, making no sense at first. Then they focused, and I stopped breathing. Our current valuation is approximately $1.6 billion, Edmund said quietly. Your grandfather's 50% stake, adjusted for growth and reinvestment over the past 49 years, is worth roughly $800 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. $800 million. I was sitting in a 15-year-old Honda with a dented bumper, living in a homeless shelter, and this man was telling me I was worth $800 million. This is a joke, I whispered. This has to be some kind of scam. Edmund's expression was infinitely gentle. I understand your skepticism. After what you've clearly been through. He gestured at my appearance, taking in the worn clothes, the exhaustion etched in my face. May I ask what happened to you? Something in his tone broke through my defenses. Maybe it was the kindness, or maybe I'd been carrying the weight alone for so long that I couldn't hold it anymore. I told him everything. The forced retirement, losing the house, the accident, the shelter, Nora's cruelty, Michael's betrayal, my family's complete abandonment. Edmund listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Your mother never told you about the business? Never. She said Grandpa worked at the mill his whole life. And she never mentioned receiving any legal documents after his death? Letters from attorneys? Not that I know of, but... I paused, remembering. She was very secretive about paperwork, always handled everything herself, never let me or my sister see any legal documents. Edmund's jaw tightened. I fear your mother may have made some very unfortunate decisions. The trust was designed to provide for Richard's family, but it required active participation. When Dorothy never responded to our letters, never claimed the inheritance, what does that mean? It means, my dear, that you've been living in poverty while you're legally entitled to one of the largest fortunes in the technology sector. I felt dizzy, like the world was tilting around me. But why are you telling me this now? Why look for me? Because I'm 78 years old, Nola. I have no children, no heirs of my own. When I die, my 50% will go to charity as planned. But your grandfather's shares, they belong to his family. They belong to you. He pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. This is a copy of your grandfather's will, filed in probate court in 1975. As you can see, everything was left to your grandmother, and upon her death, to your mother. Upon your mother's death. He pointed to a line near the bottom. To her surviving children, in equal shares. My name was right there, typed in legal language that made it indisputable. Nola Patterson, née Hale, rightful heir to Richard Hale's estate. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely a whisper. If this is real, if I'm really entitled to this money, why am I living in a shelter? Why has my life been so hard? Edmund's expression grew grim. That, my dear, is what we need to find out. He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. This is my attorney's information. I want you to call him tomorrow morning. Don't mention this conversation to anyone else yet. Not until we understand exactly what happened to your inheritance. I took the card with trembling hands. Edmund Blackwell, CEO, Blackwell Hale Technologies. Below that, an address in the Renaissance complex where million-dollar deals were made daily. One more thing, Edmund said as he prepared to get out of the car. That family of yours, the ones who cast you aside so cruelly, do they know about your grandfather's business? I thought about it, trying to remember any conversations, any hints. I don't think so. My mother never talked about it, and I certainly never knew. Edmund's smile was cold as winter. Interesting, very interesting indeed. As he walked toward the gleaming office building, leaving me alone in the parking lot, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If this was true, if I really was the heir to $800 million, then my entire life had been built on a lie. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my narrow shelter bunk, staring at Edmund Blackwell's business card until the letters blurred together. $800 million. The number was so large it felt fictional, like something from a movie rather than my actual life. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I called the attorney's office from the library's phone. Whitmore, Kessler and Associates, a crisp voice answered. I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore. Edmund Blackwell asked me to call. There was a pause. May I have your name? Nola Patterson. Nola Hale Patterson. Another pause, longer this time. Please hold. The hold music seemed to last forever. Finally, a man's voice came on the line, warm but professional. Mrs. Patterson? This is James Whitmore. Mr. Blackwell told me to expect your call. Can you come in this afternoon? Say, 2 o'clock? The law offices occupied 3 floors of a downtown tower I'd only ever seen from the outside. The elevator that carried me to the 32nd floor was lined with mirrors, and I caught glimpses of myself, a worn-down woman in thrift store clothes, completely out of place in this world of marble and mahogany. James Whitmore was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office overlooked the entire city, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a world I'd never been part of. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly shelter fee. Mr. Blackwell has filled me in on your situation. I have to say, Mrs. Patterson, this is one of the most extraordinary cases I've encountered in 30 years of practice. He opened a thick file on his desk. Let me start with what we know for certain. Your grandfather, Richard Hale, co-founded Blackwell Hale Technologies in 1974 with Edmund Blackwell. The partnership agreement was crystal clear, 50-50 ownership, with survivor rights and inheritance provisions spelled out in detail. I nodded, still struggling to believe any of this was real. When Richard died in 1975, his shares passed to your grandmother, Margaret Hale, as specified in his will. When Margaret died in 1981, those shares should have passed to your mother, Dorothy. Should have? Here's where things get complicated. Whitmore pulled out another document. We have records showing that legal notices were sent to your mother's address following Margaret's death. Multiple letters, over a period of 2 years. None were ever answered. Maybe she didn't receive them? That's what we thought initially. But yesterday, after Mr. Blackwell's call, I had my investigators do some digging. His expression grew troubled. Mrs. Patterson, your mother did receive those letters. We have postal receipts showing they were delivered and signed for. My stomach dropped. Then why didn't she respond? That's what we need to determine. But there's more. Whitmore pulled out a manila folder, thicker than the others. When someone doesn't claim an inheritance of this magnitude, there are legal procedures. The assets are held in trust, managed by court-appointed trustees. For 43 years, your family's share of Blackwell Hale has been growing. He opened the folder, revealing page after page of financial statements. The company has been extraordinarily successful. Government contracts, private development, several major acquisitions. Your 50% stake, with accumulated dividends and growth, is currently valued at approximately $827 million. The room spun around me. $827 million. While I'd been eating at soup kitchens and sleeping in shelters, I'd been one of the wealthiest people in America. I still don't understand, I said weakly. If the money was there, If it belonged to my family, why didn't we know about it? Whitmore exchanged a glance with his associate, a woman who'd been taking notes silently. Mrs. Patterson, we believe someone in your family did know about it. We just don't think it was you. What do you mean? Yesterday's investigation turned up some very interesting information. Your mother, Dorothy Hale, didn't just ignore the inheritance notices. She actively worked to prevent the claim from being processed. My mouth went dry. I don't understand. She hired an attorney, a man named Franklin Ross, to contest the inheritance. Ross filed paperwork claiming that Richard Hale's partnership with Edmund Blackwell was fraudulent, that the will was forged, that the company owed your grandfather money rather than the other way around. But that's not true, is it? Absolutely not. But the legal challenges tied up the estate for years. During that time, Dorothy received a settlement. A settlement? Whitmore pulled out another document. In 1983, to end the legal challenges, Blackwell Hale Technologies paid Dorothy Hale the sum of $150,000 in exchange for her agreement to relinquish all claims to the company. The words hit me like physical blows. My mother took money to give up our inheritance? It appears so. But here's the truly devastating part. The settlement was illegal. Dorothy didn't have the right to relinquish claims on behalf of future heirs. Your inheritance was protected by law. She could give up her own claim, but not yours. I felt sick. So she took the money and ran. It gets worse. Whitmore's voice grew grimmer. We found records showing that Dorothy used a false address when she signed the settlement. She claimed to be living in California, but postal records show she was actually in Ohio. She deliberately made it impossible for anyone to contact her again. Why would she do that? Because she knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew that eventually someone would come looking for the rightful heirs. My hands were shaking now. What about my sister? Janet would have been entitled to half as well. Yes? According to our records, your mother had 2 daughters. Both of you were cheated out of your inheritance. I thought about my phone call with Janet after I'd lost everything, her cold dismissal of my problems. Does Janet know? That's what we need to find out. Mrs. Patterson, there's one more thing. Whitmore hesitated, as if deciding how much to tell me. We believe your mother may not have acted alone. What do you mean? The attorney she hired, Franklin Ross, specialized in inheritance disputes. This kind of elaborate fraud requires inside knowledge, connections. Someone helped her understand exactly how to exploit the legal system. Who? We're still investigating. But Ross had ties to several prominent families in your area. People who might have benefited from keeping a major inheritance secret. My mind raced, trying to process everything. My mother had stolen my inheritance, with help from someone who knew the system. Someone who wanted to keep me from discovering the truth. Mr. Whitmore, I said slowly, my family, my son and his wife, they forced me out of our family business. They took everything I had. Do you think, could they have known about this? Whitmore's expression grew very serious. Mrs. Patterson, that's exactly what we intend to find out. But first, we need to establish your legal claim to the inheritance. Are you prepared to fight for what's rightfully yours? I thought about Nora's cruel texts, Michael's cold indifference, the nights I'd spent sleeping in my car. I thought about the life I could have had, should have had, if not for my mother's betrayal. Yes, I said, my voice growing stronger. I want to fight. Good, because this isn't just about money, Mrs. Patterson. This is about justice. Someone has been living off your inheritance for decades while you struggled to survive. It's time to find out who and make them pay. As I left the law office that afternoon, clutching copies of documents that proved my birthright, one thought consumed me. If my family had known about this inheritance all along, if they'd kept me poor and desperate while they lived in comfort, then everything I'd suffered had been deliberately orchestrated. And if that was true, they had no idea what was coming for them. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of living in the shelter while lawyers and private investigators unraveled 48 years of lies. Every day brought new revelations, each one more devastating than the last. I was sitting in James Whitmore's office again, but this time the atmosphere felt different, heavier. The stack of documents on his desk had grown to several thick folders, and his expression was grim. "Mrs. Patterson," he began, "what we've discovered goes far beyond your mother's theft of the inheritance. This was a conspiracy that involved your entire family." My stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" "Let's start with your sister, Janet." He opened the first folder. "After your mother died 8 years ago, Janet received a letter from our firm. We'd been trying to locate Dorothy's heirs to finally settle the inheritance issue." Janet never mentioned any letter. "Because she didn't ignore it," she responded. Whitmore pulled out a photocopy of a letter written in Janet's familiar handwriting. She claimed to be Dorothy's only surviving child. "According to this letter, you died in a car accident in 2010. The words hit me like a physical blow. "She told you I was dead?" "More than that. She provided what appeared to be a death certificate, obituary clippings, even fake funeral home records. Janet has been actively claiming your half of the inheritance for the past 8 years. My hands shook as I stared at the forged documents bearing my name. The death certificate looked official, complete with state seals and signatures. The obituary was heartbreakingly detailed, describing a fictional car accident that had supposedly claimed my life. How much money has she received? The trust pays out annual dividends to verified heirs. Janet has collected approximately $12 million over the past 8 years, claiming to be the sole beneficiary. $12 million. While I'd been struggling to survive, working multiple jobs, sleeping in my car, my own sister had been living off money that rightfully belonged to both of us. But that's not the worst part," Whitmore continued. "Janet didn't act alone. The forged documents required inside help, someone with access to official records, someone who understood how to manipulate the legal system." "Who?" "Your son-in-law's family." The investigation revealed that Nora's father, Richard Caldwell, was a business partner of Franklin Ross, the same attorney your mother used to steal the original inheritance. They've been working together for decades. The room seemed to tilt around me. Nora's family knew about the inheritance? More than knew about it. They orchestrated the entire plan to keep you from discovering it. Whitmore opened another folder, revealing financial records and correspondence. The Caldwell family has significant investments in several companies that do business with Blackwell Hale Technologies. They've been profiting indirectly from your inheritance for years. And Michael? My son? Whitmore's expression grew even more serious. "Mrs. Patterson, your son has known about your inheritance since he married Nora 7 years ago. In fact, that's why he married her." The words felt like a knife to my heart. "What?" "We found emails between Michael and Richard Caldwell dating back to 2016. Caldwell approached Michael with a proposition: marry his daughter, and they would help him access what they called family money that was being held up in legal proceedings." I couldn't breathe. My son's marriage, his sudden coldness toward me, his willingness to strip me of everything I owned, it had all been planned. "They knew that eventually the inheritance would surface," Whitmore continued. "When it did, they wanted to make sure you were in no position to claim it. Poor, isolated, with no legal representation or family support." "The business," I whispered. "They forced me out to make sure I'd be desperate." "Exactly. And there's more." He pulled out another set of documents. "The house you and your late husband owned, it wasn't sold to random buyers. The Caldwell family purchased it through a shell company, then sold it back to Michael and Nora for half the market value. They've been living in my house? Your house, bought with money from your inheritance, while you lived in a homeless shelter. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd used it to destroy my life, then moved into my home to celebrate their victory." "There's one final piece," Whitmore said quietly. "The accident that totaled your car and put you in the hospital? It wasn't random." My blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "The truck driver who hit you? He works for a company owned by Richard Caldwell. The police report has been altered. The driver's insurance information was falsified. They tried to kill you, Mrs. Patterson." The words echoed in the silence of the office. My own family had tried to murder me for money that was already mine. "They were getting nervous," Whitmore explained. Edmund Blackwell had been asking questions, hiring investigators to find Richard Hale's heirs. They knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. If you died in an accident, with Janet already established as the sole heir, the inheritance would be secure. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal. My mother had stolen my birthright. My sister had faked my death. My son had married into the conspiracy. And they'd all worked together to destroy my life, steal my money, and when that wasn't enough, they'd tried to kill me. The text messages, I said suddenly. Nora's cruel texts about sharing food with dogs. She wasn't just being vindictive. She was celebrating. She was celebrating her family's victory. Whitmore agreed. They thought they'd won. They thought you were broken, that you'd never discover the truth. But I did discover it. Yes. And now we're going to take back everything they stole from you, plus damages for 48 years of fraud. Whitmore opened a final folder. Mrs. Patterson, your inheritance isn't just the $827 million in trust. You're also entitled to punitive damages for the theft, fraud, and attempted murder. Our conservative estimate puts your total claim at over $1 billion. $1 billion. The number was so large it didn't seem real. What happens now? Now we file lawsuits. Criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Civil suits to recover every penny they stole, plus damages. We freeze all their assets immediately. The house, the business, their bank accounts, everything. And my family? Your family is going to learn that stealing from an heiress carries serious consequences. Janet will likely face federal charges for mail fraud and identity theft. Michael and Nora will lose everything: the house, the business, their freedom. The Caldwell family will face racketeering charges. I thought about the shelter where I'd been sleeping, the nights I'd gone hungry, the humiliation and despair they'd forced me to endure, all while they lived in luxury off my stolen money. When do we start? We already have. Whitmore smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. Federal marshals served warrants this morning. Your sister's assets are frozen, the house has been seized, and Michael and Nora are currently being questioned by the FBI. They know? By now, yes. They know that you're alive, that you've discovered the truth, and that their comfortable lives built on stolen money are over. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For months, I'd believed I was worthless, discarded, forgotten. Now I knew the truth. I wasn't worthless. I was worth over $1 billion. I wasn't forgotten. I was so important that an entire family had conspired to keep me from my birthright. Mr. Whitmore, I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. I want them to understand exactly what they've lost. Not just the money, but the daughter, the sister, the mother they threw away for greed. What do you have in mind? I thought about Nora's cruel messages, Michael's cold indifference, Janet's calculated betrayal. They'd wanted me to disappear, to become nothing. Instead, I was about to become one of the most powerful women in America. I want them to know that their victim just became their judge. 6 months later, I stood in the penthouse office of Blackwell Hale Technologies, looking out over a city that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving. The view from the 62nd floor was breathtaking. The entire metropolitan area spread out below like a map of possibilities. Edmund Blackwell had insisted I take the office. It's time the Hale name returned to the company, he'd said with a smile. Your grandfather would be proud. The legal proceedings had moved faster than anyone expected. When federal investigators uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy, 48 years of fraud, multiple forged documents, attempted murder, even the most experienced prosecutors were shocked by the audacity of it all. Janet was serving 12 years in federal prison for mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The look on her face when she was arrested, when she realized I wasn't dead and that her comfortable life was over, would stay with me forever. Not because I enjoyed her suffering, but because it marked the moment she finally understood the consequences of her choices. The Caldwell family had lost everything. Richard Caldwell was facing racketeering charges, their business empire dismantled, their assets seized. The house they'd bought with my stolen money, my family home, had been returned to me. I'd had it completely renovated, erasing every trace of their presence. But it was Michael and Nora's downfall that provided the most closure. They'd been so confident in their scheme, so certain they'd broken me completely. When federal agents arrived at the house that morning 6 months ago, Nora had actually laughed. "This is about that pathetic old woman?" she'd asked. "She's probably dead in a ditch somewhere." The agents had taken great pleasure in informing her that the pathetic old woman was very much alive and now worth approximately $1.2 billion. Michael's reaction had been different. When he learned the truth, that I'd been an heiress all along, that his comfortable life had been built on stolen money, that his marriage was part of a criminal conspiracy, he'd tried to call me, tried to explain, to apologize, to claim he hadn't known the full extent of the plan. I never answered those calls. The criminal charges were still pending, but the civil proceedings had concluded quickly once the evidence was presented. Every penny they'd stolen was returned with interest. The business that had been my husband's legacy was restored to me. The house, the cars, the jewelry, everything came back. But more than the money, more than the material possessions, what I'd reclaimed was something infinitely more valuable: my dignity, my worth, my sense of self. I wasn't the forgotten woman sleeping in a shelter anymore. I wasn't the unwanted mother begging for scraps of affection. I was Nola Patterson, co-owner of one of the most successful technology companies in America, heir to a fortune built by my grandfather's vision and hard work. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For weeks after the arrests, I'd stayed in a luxury hotel, still unable to believe the nightmare was over. Edmund Blackwell had been incredibly patient, introducing me gradually to the business world I'd inherited, helping me understand the scope of what was now mine. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," he'd told me over dinner at an exclusive restaurant where I'd once driven Uber passengers. "But he was also kind, generous, principled. Those qualities matter more in business than most people realize." I'd taken those words to heart as I'd begun to rebuild my life. The money was overwhelming, more than I could spend in several lifetimes, but it was the power that truly changed everything. The power to right wrongs, to help people who'd been forgotten by society, to ensure that what happened to me never happened to anyone else. I'd quietly established a foundation to help women over 50 who'd been abandoned by their families, who'd lost everything and had nowhere to turn. The homeless shelter where I'd spent those dark months received an anonymous donation of $10 million. The social worker who'd helped me apply for assistance found herself with a full scholarship to law school, though she never knew where it came from. These acts of quiet generosity brought me more satisfaction than any amount of luxury could provide. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. I was no longer afraid. For decades I'd lived in fear. Fear of disappointing my family, fear of being abandoned, fear of not being good enough. That fear had made me vulnerable to manipulation, had kept me silent when I should have spoken up, had allowed people to treat me as disposable. Now, when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone different. Not just wealthy, but strong. Not just powerful, but wise. The suffering had carved depth into my character that comfort never could have provided. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my thoughts. My assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mrs. Patterson, there's a call for you on line 2. The caller says he's your son." I stared at the blinking light for a long moment. Michael had been calling for months, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. The last few had been from prison, where he was awaiting trial. His marriage to Nora had crumbled the moment their scheme was exposed. Apparently their love hadn't been strong enough to survive poverty and disgrace. "Tell him I'm not available," I said finally, "and add his number to the blocked list." Some people might call that cruel. I called it self-preservation. Michael had made his choice when he conspired to destroy me. He'd chosen greed over love, money over family. Now he would live with the consequences of that choice, just as I'd lived with the consequences of trusting him. I walked to the window again, watching the city come alive in the early evening light. Somewhere down there, people were struggling the way I once had. Somewhere, there were women my age who'd been discarded by their families, who believed they were worthless because the people who should have loved them had said so. I thought about the message Nora had sent me during my darkest hour. Hope you're enjoying sharing food with dogs on the street. If I could send a message back to her now, in her prison cell, it would be simple. I'm not sharing food with dogs anymore. I'm feeding them. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd tried to make me disappear, to erase me from their lives and their legacy. Instead, they'd disappeared while I became more visible than ever. They'd wanted to make me nothing. Instead, they'd made me everything. But the greatest victory wasn't the money or the power, or even the justice. The greatest victory was the peace I felt, standing in my grandfather's office, finally understanding who I was meant to be. I wasn't the woman who'd been driven out of her family business in disgrace. I wasn't the mother who'd been rejected by her son. I wasn't the sister who'd been betrayed and left to die. I was Richard Hale's granddaughter, inheritor of his vision and his values. I was a survivor who'd found strength in the darkest places. I was a woman who'd learned that true worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to treat yourself. As the sun set over the city I now called home, I made a silent promise to my grandfather, whose photograph sat on my desk beside flowers that were delivered fresh every day. I would honor his legacy not just by growing the business he'd built, but by remembering that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of your humanity. I'd been given a second chance at life, and I intended to make it count. The phone rang again, but this time I answered it myself. Nola Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, this is Maria from the shelter. You said to call if we ever needed anything. We have a woman here. She's 62, just lost her job and her home. Her family won't help. She reminds me of you when you first came to us. I smiled, remembering Maria, the woman who'd slept in the bunk above me, who'd told me in the darkness that it gets easier. She was wrong. It didn't get easier. It got better. I'll be right there, I said. And Maria? Tell her that sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you're actually about to find yourself. As I gathered my coat and headed for the elevator, I thought about the woman waiting at the shelter, probably scared and alone, convinced that her life was over. Tomorrow, I would show her that sometimes endings are just beginnings in disguise. After all, I should know. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.